This is a true story from the journals of legendary British hunter and naturalist Jim Corbett, set during the British colonial era in India. It recounts his determined pursuit of the Mukteshwar man-eater, a tigress that had terrorized the Kumaon region. Corbett was a renowned figure in India, frequently called upon by the government to track and dispatch man-eating tigers and leopards that had claimed hundreds of human lives. This particular account is just one of many documented in his books, detailing his factual experiences tracking down these formidable predators. 18 miles to the northeast of Nainital lies a hill, 8,000 feet high, and stretching 12 to 15 miles long from east to west. The western end of this hill rises steeply, and it is near this end that you find the Mukteshwar Veterinary Research Institute, a place where lymph and vaccines are produced to fight the many cattle diseases of India. The laboratory and staff quarters are situated on the northern face of the hill, commanding one of the best views to be had anywhere of the Himalayan snowy range. This range and all the hills that lie between the high peaks and the plains of India run east and west. From any commanding point on these ridges, you can get an uninterrupted view not only of the great snows to the north, but of the valleys and hills to the east and west, as far as the eyes can see. People who have lived at Mukteshwar claim it is the most beautiful spot in all of Kumaon and that its climate has no equal. A tigress, who seemed to think as highly of the area as any human, took up her residence in the extensive forests adjoining this small settlement. She lived there happily, surrounded by abundant food, with plenty of deer and wild boar to hunt. She thrived in a forest where she never had to struggle for a meal. Her luck changed when she had the misfortune of an encounter with a porcupine. In that fight, she lost an eye and was left with nearly 50 quills varying from 1 to 9 inches embedded in her shoulder and under the pad of her right foreleg. Several of these quills struck bone and doubled back in a U-shape, forcing the point and broken end close together. Searing sores formed as she tried to tear the quills out with her teeth. Weak and starving, she lay in a thick patch of grass licking her wounds. It so happened that a village woman chose that very patch of grass to cut fodder for her cattle. At first, the tigress took no notice. But when the woman cut the grass right up to where she lay, the tigress struck only once. The blow crushed the woman's skull. Death was instantaneous. When she was found the next day, she still grasped her sickle in one hand and held a tuft of grass in the other, exactly as she had been at the moment she was struck. Leaving the woman where she had fallen, the tigress limped away for more than a mile and took refuge in a hollow beneath a fallen tree. 2 days later, a man came to chip firewood from that same tree. The tigress, lying on the far side, killed him as well. The man fell across the trunk. He had removed his coat and shirt for his work, and she clawed his bare back as she killed him. It is possible that the sight of blood trickling down his body as he hung across the bole of the tree first gave her the idea that he was something she could use to satisfy her hunger. Whatever the reason, before leaving him, she ate a small portion from his back. A day later, she killed her third victim deliberately and without any provocation. From then on, she became an established man-eater. I heard of the tigress shortly after she started killing human beings. However, there were a number of sportsmen at Mukteshwar who were all keen on bagging a tiger right on their doorsteps. So I didn't think it would be right for an outsider to meddle. But when the toll of human victims rose to 24, and the lives of the villagers were endangered, and work at the institute slowed down, the veterinary officer in charge requested the government to ask for my help. My task, as I saw it, was not going to be an easy one, apart from the fact that my experience with man-eaters was very limited. The extensive ground where the tigress was operating was unknown to me. I had no idea where to look for her. accompanied by a servant and 2 men carrying a suitcase and a roll of bedding. I left Nainital at midday and walked 10 miles to the Ramgarh Dak bungalow, one of the government rest houses found along these mountain roads. The Khansama, the bungalow's cook and general caretaker, was a friend of mine, and when he learned I was on my way to Mukteshwar to try for the man-eater, he warned me to be very careful while negotiating those last 2 miles into the settlement. Several people, he said, had recently been killed on that exact stretch of road. I left my men to pack up and follow me while I armed myself with a double-barreled .500 express rifle. I was using modified cordite, a powerful propellant that gave this rifle the heavy stopping power needed for a charging tiger. Making a very early start the next morning, I arrived at the junction where the Nainital Almora and Mukteshwar roads meet, just as it was getting light. From this point on, it was necessary to walk with total caution. I was now in the man-eater's country. Before the road begins its steep, zigzagging climb up the face of the hill, it runs for a distance over a stretch of flat ground. Here, the hillsides are dotted with the orange-colored lily, a flower that is more than just a bit of local beauty. Its seeds are round and remarkably hard, so much so that they can actually be used as shot in a muzzle-loading gun when lead is scarce. This was my first time ever climbing this particular hill, and I found myself studying the sandstone cliffs that overhung the road with a great deal of interest. Over the ages, the wind has hollowed out various caves in the stone. They are of all different sizes. Some are quite shallow, while others appear to penetrate deep into the heart of the sandstone. I couldn't help but imagine that in a heavy gale, these caves must produce some incredibly weird and haunting sounds as the wind whistles through them. Finally, the road reaches a saddle in the hill, opening up into a small area of flat ground on the far side. This plateau is flanked by the Mukteshwar post office and a small market. It was still very early when I arrived, and while the post office was shuttered, one of the shops was already open. The shopkeeper was a helpful soul and very kindly gave me directions to the Dak bungalow, which he told me was about half a mile away on the northern face of the hill. Now, there are actually 2 Dak bungalows, those government-run rest houses at Mukteshwar. One is strictly reserved for officials on duty, and the other is for the general public. Being a stranger to the place, I didn't know this, and my shopkeeper friend made a mistake. Perhaps it was because of the size of my hat, which he might have taken as a sign of rank. But he directed me to the official bungalow. My arrival there caused a bit of a stir with what I call the Red Tape Brigade. The Khansama, the bungalow's cook and general manager, incurred their displeasure by providing me with breakfast, and I incurred it by eating it. At the time, I was blissfully ignorant of the rules I was breaking, but later on, I made it a point to ensure that the Khansama didn't suffer any professional trouble because of my mistake. While I was waiting for my breakfast and admiring the truly superb view of the snowy Himalayan range, a party of 12 Europeans passed by. They were all carrying service rifles and were followed a few minutes later by a sergeant and 2 men carrying targets and flags. The sergeant was a friendly fellow and stopped to talk for a moment. He informed me that the party was on its way to the rifle range and that they were making it a point to keep together in a large group specifically because of the man-eater. I learned from him that the officer in charge of the institute had received a telegram from the government the day before, letting him know I was on my way. The sergeant seemed genuinely hopeful that I would succeed in bagging the tigress. He explained that conditions in the settlement had become extremely difficult. The fear was so thick that no one, even in the middle of a bright day, dared to move about alone. As soon as dusk fell, everyone retreated behind locked doors and stayed there until morning. He also mentioned that many attempts had already been made to shoot the man-eater, but it seemed to have a sixth sense. It had never once returned to a kill that men had sat over. Once I had finished a very good breakfast, I gave instructions to the Khansama I told him to let my men know when they finally arrived, that I had gone out to seek news of the tiger, and that I couldn't say when I would be back. Then, picking up my rifle, I walked up to the post office to send a telegram to my mother. Standing on the flat ground in front of the post office and the market, you can look out over the southern face of the Mukteshwar Hills. The land falls away steeply, carved into a maze of ridges and ravines that are overgrown with dense brushwood and a few scattered trees. As I stood there on the edge of the hill, looking down into the valley and toward the well-wooded Ramgar Hills in the distance, I was joined by the postmaster and several of the local shopkeepers. The postmaster had been the one to handle the government telegram the day before. When he saw my signature on the form I had just handed in, he realized I was the man the government had sent for. He and his friends had come out specifically to offer me their help, and I was very glad for the offer. In rural India, the post office and the banya, the local shopkeeper's store, are to the village folk what taverns and clubs are to people in other lands. They are the heart of the community. If you are looking for information on any subject, especially something as serious as a man-eater, there is no better place to find it. Looking out to our left front, about 2 miles away and 1,000 feet below our position, there was a patch of cultivation tucked into a fold of the hill. I was told this was Badri Shah's apple orchard. Badri is the son of an old friend of mine, and he had actually visited me in Nainital months ago. At the time, he had offered me his guest house and any assistance he could give to help me shoot the tiger. I hadn't accepted his offer then, as I didn't want to interfere while local sportsmen were still trying their hand. But now, since I was here at the request of the government, I decided I would call on him and accept his help, especially after the men told me that the most recent human kill had taken place in the very valley below his orchard. I thanked the men for their information and told them I would be relying on them for more news as it came in. Then, I set off down the Thari road. The day was still young, and I felt there was enough time to visit some of the villages further along the hill to the east before I doubled back to see Badri. There weren't any milestones along the road to mark my progress, but after I had covered what I guessed was about 6 miles and visited 2 villages, I decided it was time to turn back. I had retraced my steps for about 3 miles when I overtook a small girl who was having a very difficult time with a bullock. The girl, a little thing of about 8 years, was trying her best to get the bullock to head toward Mukteshwar. The bullock, however, had other ideas and was determined to go in the exact opposite direction. By the time I came upon them, they had reached a total stalemate. Neither would budge an inch. The bullock was actually a quiet old beast, and once the girl took her place in front with the lead rope, and I fell in behind to keep him moving, he gave us no more trouble. As we walked, I overheard her addressing the animal. She was calling him Kalwa. Kalwa is a common name in these hills for a black bullock, much like the name of a dark-furred dog, Blackie. Hoping to start a conversation, I decided to tease her a little. "We aren't stealing Kalwa, are we?" I asked.
"No,"
she snapped back indignantly, turning her big brown eyes toward me with a look of pure offense. "Well, who does he belong to then?"
"It belongs next to my father."
"And where are we taking him?"
"To my uncle."
"And why does your uncle need Kalwa?"
"To plow his field, of course."
"But Kalwa can't plow a field all by himself," I said, playing a bit of the fool.
"Of course not."
It was clear she thought I was being quite stupid. But then, I suppose you couldn't expect a sahib, a gentleman or foreigner, to understand the simple mechanics of bullocks and plowing. "Does your uncle only have one bullock then?"
"Yes, he only has one now, but he used to have 2.
"And where is the other one?"
The tiger killed it yesterday."
That was news indeed. I walked on in silence for a while, digesting this information, while the girl kept casting glances back at me. Finally, She plucked up the courage to ask.
Have you come to shoot the tiger?
Yes, I told her. I've come to try and shoot it.
Then why are you walking away from the kill?
Because we have to get Kalwa to your uncle first. This answer seemed to satisfy her logic, and we trudged on. I had already gathered some very useful leads, but I wanted to know more. Don't you know the tiger is a man-eater? I asked her.
Oh yes, it ate Kunti's father and Bonshi Singh's mother and lots of other people.
Then why did your father send you out with Kalwa? Why didn't he come himself?
Because he has Babri Bukhar.
Babri Bukhar, the local name for a heavy racking bout of malaria. Don't you have any brothers?
No, I had one, but he died a long time ago.
A mother?
Yes, she's at home cooking the food.
A sister?
No sister.
It struck me then just how much had fallen onto the shoulders of this one small girl. She had been given the dangerous task of leading her father's bullock to her uncle along a stretch of road where grown men were terrified to walk unless they were in large shouting parties. I had been on this road for 4 hours, and in all that time, I hadn't seen another living soul. Eventually, we reached a small path. The girl led the way up. The bullock followed, and I brought up the rear. We soon came to a field with a small house sitting on the far side. As we got closer, the girl called out to her uncle, letting him know she had brought Kalwa safely. A man's voice drifted out from the house.
Tie him to the post, Putli, and go home. I'm eating my food.
Putli is a local name that translates roughly to dolly, so she tied Kalwa to the post as instructed, and we headed back toward the road, without the bullock acting as a bridge between us. Putli suddenly became very shy. She wouldn't walk beside me, so I took the lead and slowed my pace to match hers. After a bit of silent walking, I spoke up. I want to shoot that tiger that killed your uncle's bullock, but I don't know where it happened. Will you show me the way?
Oh yes, I'll show you.
Have you seen the kill yourself?
No, I haven't seen it. But I heard my uncle telling my father where it was.
Is it close to the road?
I don't know.
Was the bullock all alone when the tiger got it?
No, it was out with the village cattle.
And did it happen in the morning or the evening?
It was in the morning, just as it was going out to graze with the cows.
As we talked, I kept a very sharp lookout. The road was flanked on the left by heavy, dark tree jungle, and on the right by a dense wall of scrub, perfect cover for an ambush. We had gone about a mile when we reached a well-worn cattle track, branching off into the jungle on the left. Putli stopped there and pointed. This was the track, she said, where her uncle had told her father the bullock had been taken. I now had all the particulars I needed to find the kill. After seeing the little girl safely to her home, I made my way back to the cattle track. This path cut across a valley, and I had followed it for about 1/4 of a mile when I found the spot where the cattle had stampeded. The ground was churned up where the herd had suddenly bolted off the track in terror. Instead of staying on the path, I moved through the jungle parallel to it, staying about 50 yards below the track. I hadn't gone very far when I crossed a drag mark, the unmistakable trail left in the dirt and leaves when a tiger hauls a heavy carcass. It led straight down into the valley. After following it for a few hundred yards, I found the bullock. Only a small portion of its hindquarters had been eaten. It was lying at the foot of a bank about 20 feet high, roughly 40 feet from the head of a deep ravine. Looking for a place to wait for the tiger's return, I spotted a stunted tree between the ravine and the kill. It was completely smothered by a wild rose bush. This was the only tree within a reasonable distance that offered any hope of a shot. I knew there would be no moon that night, and if the tiger returned after dark, which I was certain it would, I needed to be as close to the carcass as possible to see anything at all. It was now 2 p.m. I had been walking since leaving Ramgarh at 4 o'clock that morning, and I was in desperate need of a cup of tea. The road to Badri Orchard takes off near the cattle track and drops a mile down a steep hill through dense brushwood. I found Badri near his guest house attending to an apple tree that had been damaged. He took me up to the house, which sat on a little knoll overlooking the rows of fruit trees. While we sat on the veranda waiting for the tea and food he'd ordered his servant to prepare, I told him why I had come to Mukteshwar and described the kill the young girl had shown me. I asked Badri why this particular kill hadn't been reported to the other hunters at the settlement. He explained that the villagers had lost all confidence in the local sportsmen after so many failed attempts. Because of this, they had simply stopped reporting kills. He believed the failures were due to the elaborate preparations the other men made. They would clear all the bushes and small trees around a kill, and build massive machan, the elevated platforms used for sitting over a tiger. These large structures, often occupied by several men at once, were more than enough to warn a wary tiger. It was no wonder the animal had earned a reputation for never returning to a kill. Badri was convinced there was only one tiger terrorizing the Mukteshwar district. He knew it was slightly lame in its right foreleg, though he couldn't say if the animal was a male or a female, or what had caused the injury. As we sat there, a large Airedale Terrier was resting on the veranda with us. Suddenly, the dog began to growl. Looking where he was facing, we saw a large langur, the black-faced, long-tailed monkey of the Himalayas, sitting on the ground. It was holding down a branch of an apple tree, busily eating the unripe fruit. Badri picked up a shotgun that was leaning against the railing and fired a load of number 4 shot. The range was too great for the pellets to do the monkey any harm, but the blast sent the langur galloping up the hill with a dog in hot pursuit. Fearing the dog might get hurt, I asked Badri to call him back, but he told me not to worry. The dog was always chasing this particular animal, which had caused a lot of damage to his young trees. This time, however, the langur had reached its limit. When the dog got within a few yards, the langur whipped around, grabbed the terrier by the ears, and bit a clean chunk out of the side of its head. It was a severe wound, and by the time we had finished dressing it, my tea and a plate of hot porris, a traditional Indian unleavened bread that is deep-fried in butter, were ready for me. I told Badri about the rose-covered tree I intended to sit in. When I prepared to head back to the kill, he insisted on coming with me, bringing along 2 men carrying the materials to lash together a small machan. Badri and the 2 men had lived under the shadow of this man-eater for over a year, and they didn't have any illusions about what we were dealing with. When they saw the tree I had selected, which was the only one near the kill where a machan could even be built, they strongly urged me not to sit up that night. They assumed that the tiger would eventually remove the kill and provide me with a much more suitable place to set up the following evening. I might have followed their advice if the tiger had been an ordinary one, but because it was a man-eater, I was disinclined to miss a single chance that might not come again the next day, even if it meant taking a bit of a risk. There was also the constant threat of bears. They are one of the few animals in the Indian jungle with the raw courage to actually challenge a tiger and drive it off its own kill. If a bear caught the scent of the kill, any hope I had of getting a shot at the tiger would disappear. Climbing into that tree, smothered as it was by the wild rosebush, was a difficult and painful feat. Once I had made myself as comfortable as the sharp thorns would permit, and my rifle had been handed up to me. Badri and his men left, promising to return early the next morning. I sat facing the hill with the ravine directly behind me. I was in clear view of any animal coming down from the hill above, but if the tiger came from below, as I expected her to, it wouldn't be able to see me until it was right at the kill. The bullock, which was white, was lying on its right side, with its legs pointing toward me. I had taken my seat at a distance of only 15 feet. I settled in at 4 p.m. As an hour passed, a cocker, the small Indian barking deer, began barking on the side of the ravine about 200 yards below my position. The tiger was definitely on the move. Having spotted the predator, the cocker stood its ground and barked for a long time. Eventually, the barking grew fainter and fainter until the sound finally died away as the deer moved around the shoulder of the hill. This behavior told me that after the tiger had come within sight of the kill, it had laid down. I had expected this to happen, especially after what Badri told me about the other hunters' failures. I knew the tiger would now be lying somewhere nearby with her eyes and ears open, making absolutely certain there were no human beings near the kill before it decided to approach it. As dusk came, the objects on the hill in front of me became indistinct and then faded out completely. I could still see the kill as a faint white blur when I heard the snap of a stick at the head of the ravine. Then came the sound of stealthy steps. They moved toward me and then stopped immediately below my tree for a minute or two. There was a period of dead silence, and then the tiger lay down on the dry leaves right at the foot of the tree. Heavy clouds had rolled up near sunset, and there was now a black canopy overhead that blotted out all the stars. When the tiger eventually got up and moved to the kill, the night was what could only be described as pitch black, no matter how much I strained my eyes. I could see nothing of the white bullock, and even less of the tiger. On reaching the kill, the tiger started blowing on it. In the Himalayan summer, fresh kills attract swarms of hornets. While most leave as the light fades, some stay behind on the meat. A tiger, likely having had a bitter experience with stings in the past, will blow a heavy gust of air to clear the hornets off the exposed flesh before it starts to feed. I knew there was no need to hurry my shot, even as close as it was. The tiger wouldn't see me unless I drew her attention with a sudden movement or sound. I can usually see reasonably well on a dark night if there is starlight, but there were no stars that night, nor was there a single flicker of lightning in those heavy clouds. The tiger had not moved to the kill before starting to eat, so I knew she was lying broadside to me on the right-hand side of the bullock. Because of the previous attempts on her life, I had suspected she wouldn't show up until after dark. My original intention had been to take what aim I could by the light of the stars and then move the muzzle so the bullet would go a foot or two to the right of the white blur. But now that the clouds had made my eyes useless, I had to depend entirely on my ears. My hearing at that time was perfect. Raising the rifle and resting my elbows on my knees, I took careful aim at the sound the tiger was making. While holding the rifle steady, I turned my right ear toward the sound to center it, and then turned back again. I felt my aim was a little too high, so I lowered the muzzle a fraction of an inch and listened once more. After I had satisfied myself that I was pointing exactly at the sound, I moved the muzzle a little to the right and pressed the trigger. The tigress was up the 20-foot bank in an instant. I could hear her moving across the dry leaves until she reached a small patch of flat ground at the top. After that, the hill rose steeply, and the forest went silent. That silence was heavy with uncertainty. It could have meant that she had collapsed and died on reaching the flat ground, or it could have meant my shot had missed her entirely. I kept the rifle to my shoulder and listened intently for 3 or 4 minutes. But when no further sound came, I finally began to lower the weapon. The moment I moved, a deep guttural growl vibrated from the top of the bank. The tigress was unwounded, and she had seen me. My seat in the tree had originally been about 10 feet above the ground, but because the rose bush was soft and had nothing solid to support me, it had sagged under my weight. I was now perhaps no more than 8 feet up, with my feet dangling considerably lower than that. Just 20 feet away and slightly above my head, a tiger I had every reason to believe was a man-eater was growling deep in her throat. Being near a tiger in the daylight, even when it hasn't spotted you, causes a strange physical reaction, a disturbance in the bloodstream as your body recognizes the presence of a master predator. But when that tiger is a man-eater, and it is 10 o'clock on a pitch-black night, and you know those eyes are fixed on you, that disturbance becomes a storm. I've always mentioned that a tiger does not kill more than it needs to unless it is provoked. This tigress already had a kill that would have lasted her 2 or 3 days. There was no biological necessity for her to kill me. Even so, I had an uneasy feeling that, on this particular night, this tiger might prove to be the exception to that rule. I knew that despite my nerves, I was perfectly safe as long as I didn't lose my balance. There was nothing to hold on to, and if I fell asleep or slipped, I would be at her mercy. There was no longer any reason to deny myself a smoke. I took out my cigarette case, and as I struck a match, I heard the tiger move away from the edge of the bank. A few minutes later, however, she returned and growled again. I had finished 3 cigarettes, and the tiger was still there with me when the rain began. A few large drops at first, followed quickly by a heavy downpour. I had been wearing light clothes since starting out from Rumgar that morning, and within minutes, I was wet to the skin. There wasn't a single leaf above me to break the fall of the raindrops. I knew the tigress would have hurried off to find shelter under a tree or the lee of a rock as soon as the rain started. The downpour continued until 11 o'clock that night. Then, at 4 in the morning, the rain finally stopped and the sky cleared. At an elevation of 8,000 feet, the mountain air is thin and unforgiving. Being soaked to the skin is miserable enough. But once the clouds vanished, a biting wind began to howl across the ridges. It hit my sodden clothes with a freezing edge, and where I had been merely cold before, I was now completely frozen. Whenever I feel a twinge of rheumatism today, I am taken back to that night and others like it. I've learned to be thankful that it is no more than a twinge. Badri, being the good friend that he was, arrived just as the sun was rising. He brought a man along carrying a kettle of hot tea. As I slid down from my perch, the 2 men had to catch me. My legs were so cramped and stiff from the cold that they simply refused to function. I lay there on the ground, drinking the tea while they massaged my legs to restore the circulation. Once I was finally able to stand, Badri sent his man ahead to light a fire in the guest house. I was curious to see how my shot had fared, as I had never used my ears alone to direct a bullet before. I was interested to find that I had missed the tigress's head by only a few inches. My elevation had been perfect, but I hadn't moved the muzzle of the rifle far enough to the right. The bullet had struck the white bullock just 6 inches from where the tigress had been feeding. The tea and the half-mile walk back up to the road helped take the creases out of my joints. By the time we started down the mile-long track toward Badri's orchard, my only real discomforts were my wet clothes and an empty stomach. The track ran over red clay, which the heavy rain had made incredibly slippery. In the mud, we could clearly see 3 sets of tracks, Badri's and his man's footprints going up, and the man's tracks coming back down. For about 50 yards, there were only those 3 sets of prints. Then, at a bend in the path, the tracks of a tigress appeared. She had jumped down from a bank on the right and followed directly on the heels of Badri's man. The man's footprints and the pug marks of the tigress showed that both had been traveling at a very fast pace. There was nothing Badri or I could do at that point. The man had a 20-minute lead on us. If he hadn't reached the safety of the orchard already, he would be beyond any help we could give him. With uneasy thoughts weighing on us, we made what speed we could on the slippery ground. We were immensely relieved when we reached a point where the orchard was visible to see the man was safe. The tigress had veered off down a side path, while the man had carried on to the orchard. When we questioned him later, the man admitted he had no idea he had been followed by the man-eater at all. while my clothes were drying in front of a roaring wood fire in the guest house. I questioned Badri about the stretch of jungle into which the tigress had disappeared. Badri told me the path she had taken ran down into a deep and densely wooded ravine. This ravine extended down the face of a very steep hill until it met another ravine coming in from the right. At the junction where these two ravines met, there was a stream and an open patch of ground, which according to Badri commanded a clear view of the exits from both ravines. Badri was of the opinion that the tigress would lie up for the day in that specific ravine. Since the terrain seemed to favor it, we decided to try and get a shot at her by organizing a beat, provided we could find enough men to carry it out. A beat is a traditional method used to flush a predator out of dense cover. A line of men moves through the jungle, creating a wall of noise by shouting, clapping, and rolling rocks down the slopes. The goal is to unsettle the animal and drive it toward a specific point where the hunter is waiting silently in ambush. Govind Singh, Badri's head gardener, was summoned, and we explained the plan to him. He told us that if he were given until midday, he could muster a gang of 30 men for the beat. However, he also had to carry out his master's orders to gather 410 pounds of peas. Badri had an extensive vegetable garden alongside his apple orchard, and the previous evening he had received a telegram with important news. The price of peas on the Nainital market had jumped to 4 pence a pound. Badri was naturally anxious to take advantage of this high price. His men were busy gathering the crop so it could be dispatched by pack pony that night, ensuring it arrived in Nainital for the early morning market. After I had finished cleaning my rifle and taken a walk around the orchard, I joined Badri for his morning meal, which he had moved forward an hour just to suit my schedule. At midday, exactly as promised, Govind produced his gang of 30 men. It was essential for someone to stay behind and supervise the pea pickers, so Badri decided to remain at the orchard and send Govind to lead the beat. Govind and the 30 men were all local residents. They knew exactly what kind of danger a man-eater represented. However, once I had explained what I needed them to do, they all expressed their willingness to follow my instructions. The plan was for Badri to give me an hour's start so I could search the ravine for the tigress myself. If I failed to get a shot during that time, I would take up my position on the open ground near the stream. Govind, meanwhile, was to divide his men into 2 parties, taking charge of one himself and putting a reliable man in charge of the other. At the end of that hour, Badri would fire a shot to signal the start. The 2 parties would then set off, one on either side of the ravine, rolling rocks down and shouting and clapping as they moved. It sounded simple enough, but I had my doubts. I have seen many beats go wrong. I went back up the track I had come down that morning and followed the path the tigress had taken. I had only gone a short distance. However, when the trail simply petered out into a vast expanse of dense brushwood, I spent some time forcing my way through for several hundred yards, finding that the hillside was cut up by a series of deep ridges and ravines. I began making my way down a ridge that I thought marked the right-hand boundary of the area we were meant to beat. Eventually, I came to a big drop. At the bottom, the ravine, on my left, met the one coming down from the right, and just as Badri had described, there was a stream at the junction. As I stood there looking down, wondering where the open ground was, where I should take my stand, I heard the distinct buzzing of flies nearby. I followed the sound and soon came upon the remains of a cow that had been killed about a week before. The ragged marks on the cow's throat made it clear she had been taken by a tiger. For no obvious reason, the predator had left most of the carcass untouched, eating only a small portion of the shoulders, neck, and head. I gripped what remained and dragged it to the edge of the slope, sending it crashing down the steep hillside, just a short distance from the stream. Working my way around to the left, I found a patch of open ground on a ridge about 300 yards from where the carcass had landed. The terrain here was nothing like what I had imagined from above. There was simply no vantage point where I could stand and overlook the hillside we intended to beat. From where I stood, the tigress could have broken out of the cover almost anywhere without me ever laying eyes on her. Before I could adjust my position, it was already too late. I heard the distant crack of a shot, Badri letting me know the beat had officially begun. For a while, the sound of men shouting drifted toward me, and I braced myself, expecting the tigress to appear. But then, the voices began to fade, growing fainter and more distant, until the forest went completely silent again. An hour passed before I heard the beaters once more. They were coming down the hill well to my right. When they were level with me, I shouted for them to stop and join me up on the ridge. It wasn't anyone's fault that the plan had failed. We had tried to drive a tiger through a massive tangled area of dense brushwood, using only a handful of untrained men and no prior preparation. It was the kind of terrain that even hundreds of seasoned beaters would have struggled to manage. The men were exhausted. They sat together in a bunch, picking long thorns out of their hands and feet while smoking my cigarettes. Govind and I stood apart from them, discussing his idea to try again tomorrow, perhaps by gathering every available man from Mukteshwar in the nearby villages. Suddenly, right in the middle of a sentence, Govind went silent. I saw his eyes narrow as he looked past my shoulder, a look of pure disbelief crossing his face. I swung around to see what had caught his attention. There, about 400 yards away on the far side of the stream, the tigress was quietly walking across an old abandoned field, heading straight toward us. When you see a tiger approaching in the wild, even when you are far from any village, your mind starts to race with all the things that could go wrong and spoil your chance. I remember one particular occasion that often comes to my mind during moments like this. I was sitting on a hillside overlooking a game track, waiting for a buffalo killer. That track led toward Baram Kathan, a sacred shrine dedicated to Baram, the ancient god of the jungle. The local villagers have a deep-seated belief that Baram acts as a guardian over both the people and the forest creatures. And for generations, they have maintained that no animal is ever to be killed within his domain. In all my years in those forests, I have never known a single animal to be shot near that shrine. Despite it being a favorite spot for poachers and sportsmen alike, on that day, I had purposely selected a spot about a mile away from the shrine's boundary. I was settled behind a bush by 4 p.m. An hour later, I heard the bell-like call of a sambar deer from the direction I expected the tiger. Soon after, a kakar, the barking deer, began its warning call even closer to me. The tiger was definitely coming. The jungle there was fairly open, filled mostly with young jamun trees, the Indian blackberry, about 2 to 3 feet in girth. I finally caught sight of him, a massive male tiger about 200 yards away. He was moving slowly, and when he had closed the distance to 100 yards, I suddenly heard the faint swish of leaves above me. I looked up and saw one of the young jamun trees, its branches tangled with another, beginning to lean over with agonizing slowness. It tilted until it pressed against a second tree of the same size. For a few heartbeats, the second tree held the weight, but then it too began to give way. The two trees leaned together at about a 30-degree angle until they hit a third smaller tree. There was a brief pause, and then all three crashed to the forest floor. I kept one eye on the tiger the whole time. At the first sound of those shifting leaves, he had stopped dead in his tracks. When the trees finally hit the ground, he simply turned around and walked back the way he had come, showing no sign of fear or hurry. What made that moment so haunting was that those trees were young and healthy. There had been no rain to loosen the soil, and not even a breath of wind was moving through the forest that afternoon. Yet, those trees fell directly across the track, stopping the tiger when he was only 70 yards away from giving me the shot I had waited all day for. It felt as though the jungle itself had decided the hunt was over. A shot can be spoiled in a dozen different ways when you're hunting in an inhabited area at any moment. A party of men might appear, traveling between villages or heading to the markets, or a sudden blast from a shotgun might ring out from a nearby orchard to scare away marauding lungurs. The tigress still had 300 yards to cover before she reached the stream. 200 of those yards were across completely open ground, a stretch without a single tree or bush for cover. She was approaching at a slight angle, and because any movement on our part would have been spotted instantly, there was nothing I could do but sit and watch her. I have seen many tigers in my time, but none have ever moved with such agonizing slowness. The people of Mukteshwar knew her as the lame tiger, but as I studied her through the distance, I couldn't see a single sign of a limp. My plan began to take shape as I tracked her progress. I would wait until she entered the thick scrub jungle on the far side, then sprint forward to intercept her, either before or after she crossed the water. Had there been even a scrap of cover between me and the point she was making for, I would have moved immediately to try for a shot on the open ground, but the hillside was bare. To move then would have been to lose her, so I was forced to wait until she finally disappeared into the bushes near the stream. I turned to the men and told them not to move an inch or make a single sound until I returned, the moment the tigress was out of sight. I set off at a run. The hill was steep, and I had to move quickly along the contour, the level line across the slope to maintain my speed without slipping. My path was suddenly blocked by a massive wild rosebush that stretched far up and down the hillside. The only way through was a low natural tunnel right through the center of the thorns. I bent low to sprint through it, but halfway through, my hat was knocked off. In my haste to get clear of the tunnel, I raised my head a fraction of an inch too soon. The thorns caught me instantly, nearly dragging me off my feet as they buried themselves in my scalp. These mountain roses are not like the ones in a garden. Their thorns are curved, incredibly strong and sharp as fishhooks. Because of my momentum, I couldn't stop myself. Several of the thorns embedded so deeply that they snapped off inside my head. Thorns that my sister Maggie would later have a difficult time probing out when I finally got home. Others tore through the skin, leaving me with trickles of blood running down my face as I broke cover and continued the hunt. I continued my run until I reached the edge of the hollow where I had rolled the cow's carcass earlier. This hollow was about 40 yards long and 30 yards wide. Its upper end, where the remains of the cow lay, was thick with dense brushwood that extended up the hill and along the far bank. The lower half of this area, including the bank on my side, was relatively clear of bushes. As I reached the rim and looked down, I heard the distinct sharp crack of a bone. The tigress had reached the hollow before me, finding the old kill I had discarded. She was now trying to make a meal out of what little was left. I knew that if she finished and stepped out into the open, I would have my shot. However, if she decided to move up the hill or along the far bank, she would remain hidden in that thick cover I could hear her moving through. A narrow path ran up the bank on my side, passing just a yard to my left. Beyond that path was a sheer 50-foot drop into the stream below. I was weighing the idea of throwing a stone into the brush to flush her out when I heard a soft sound behind me. I spun around to find Govind standing there, holding my hat in his hand. In those days, a European in India was rarely seen outdoors without a hat. It was considered an essential piece of equipment for protection and status. Having seen mine knocked off in the rosebush, Govind had braved the man-eater's territory just to retrieve it for me. There was a small hole in the hillside right next to us. Putting a finger to my lips, I gripped Govind by the arm and pressed him into the opening. He sat there on his haunches, chin resting on his knees and clutching my hat to his chest. He looked quite miserable, fitting perfectly into the hole while the sound of the tigress crunching bones echoed just a few yards away. He looked quite miserable, fitting perfectly into that hole, while the sound of the tigress crunching bones echoed just a few yards away. As I stood back up and took my position at the edge of the bank, the crunching stopped. The tigress had either spotted me or simply decided the old kill wasn't worth the effort. For one long, silent minute, nothing moved. Then, I caught sight of her. She had climbed the opposite bank and was moving along the top toward the hill. A stand of poplar saplings, each about 6 inches thick, stood between us. I could only see the flickering outline of her body as she moved through them. Knowing this might be my only chance, I raised my rifle and took a hurried shot, hoping the bullet would find a gap between the saplings. The moment the shot rang out, the tigress whipped around. She charged down the bank across the hollow and up the path on my side as fast as she could go. At the time, I didn't know my bullet had actually hit a sapling right next to her head, nor did I know she was blind in one eye. What looked like a terrifying, deliberate charge might have just been a frightened animal running blindly away from a threat she couldn't locate. To me, however, she looked like a wounded and very angry man-eater coming straight for my throat. I waited until she was only 2 yards away. Leaning forward, I managed to put my remaining bullet exactly where her neck joined her shoulder. The impact of the heavy .500 bullet deflected her just enough to miss my left shoulder, and her own momentum carried her right over the 50-foot drop. She hit the stream below with a tremendous splash. I stepped to the edge and looked down. The tigress was lying submerged in a pool, feet in the air with the water slowly turning red around her. At a sign from me, Govind crawled out of his hole. The moment he saw her, he let out a shout to the men on the ridge. "The tiger is dead! The tiger is dead!" The 30 men on the ridge took up the cry, their voices echoing through the valley. Badri, hearing the commotion from the orchard, fired off 10 rounds from his shotgun in celebration. The shots were heard in Mukteshwar and all the surrounding villages, and soon people were converging on the stream from every direction. Willing hands hauled the tigress from the pool and lashed her to a sapling. They carried her in a triumphant procession back to Badri's orchard, where she was laid on a bed of straw for everyone to see. I finally went to the guest house for that cup of tea I had been wanting. An hour later, under the glow of hand lanterns and surrounded by a great crowd of villagers and local sportsmen, I began to skin the tigress. It was then that I confirmed she was indeed blind in one eye. More importantly, I found nearly 50 porcupine quills ranging from 1 to 9 inches long embedded deep in her arm and under the pad of her right foreleg. These quills are what transform a normal predator into a man-eater. The constant, searing pain of those festering wounds makes it impossible for a tiger to hunt its natural fast-moving prey, forcing it to turn to easier targets like humans. By 10 o'clock that night, the job was done. I declined Badri's kind offer to stay the night and began the climb back to Mukteshwar with the crowd. My 2 men carrying the skin. We reached the post office at midnight, where I spread the skin out for the postmaster and his friends to see before catching a few hours of sleep in the public bungalow. 4 hours later, I was on the road again. By midday, I was back in my home in Nainital, having been away for exactly 72 hours. There is a deep sense of satisfaction that comes with ending a man-eater's reign. Satisfaction in finishing a job that desperately needed doing, in outmaneuvering a worthy opponent on its own ground, and most of all, in knowing that a small corner of the world was now safe again for a brave little girl like Putli to walk in.